morning. It is fantastic to be back at the Values Voter Summit. And I'm the first person who gets to speak from Heritage, and I just want to say on behalf of all my colleagues at the Heritage Foundation, we are delighted to be here with you. We're delighted to stand with you, and we look forward to getting energized over the next couple of days for 2012 and beyond. So thank you all very much for being here. We're in Washington, so I'm going to begin with some bad news. The bad news is, as many of you know, we are a nation in debt. And as of this morning, as of today, every man, woman, and child in America, if we had to pay up, would have to send in a check to the government for $47,000. That's just today, $47,000. Now let me make that number a little higher for you. Let me tell you the news gets worse. If we were going to actually pay for all the promises that we've made to current Americans, these are current promises, whether it's Social Security promises, whether it's Medicare promises, whether it's other government programs such as welfare and the like, every person in this country, your children, your grandchildren, you now have a $200,000 bill that you would have to pay. Now, everyone in this room knows that's not sustainable. The White House makes sense down there for some reason. For a lot of folks on Capitol Hill, makes sense still. They think we don't have to do too much about this, but we know different. And everybody around this country, I believe, knows different. Even state capitals are waking up, and they know it's not sustainable. And when we talk about the American dream, which is going to be the topic of our panel, we're not just talking about the white picket fence, as great as that might be when people say, I want to go own my own home. When we say the American dream is threatened, we're talking about individual liberty being threatened. We're talking about limited government going away. We're talking about the inability to really provide a strong defense for our country. We're talking about the free enterprise system being under attack. And we're talking about traditional American values being under attack because the government is taking over every aspect of our lives. That's what's at stake when we talk about the American dream. So now let's talk about the good news. The good news is we can do something about it. We've got a big project ahead of us, but everybody in this room I know believes we can do something about it, or you wouldn't have been here this morning. You're here because you know we can turn it around. And what we want to talk about this morning is how do we go about doing that? A few months ago, 5 think tanks around the country, most based here in Washington, were asked if you could put together a comprehensive plan to tackle the debt, to tackle spending, to get our country back on track, to restore opportunity, to restore prosperity, what would you do? Well, the Heritage Plan was one of those 5 think tanks that put a plan forward. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning, because there's a lot of options out there. Believe it or not, there were some think tanks who came forward and said, you know what, we can just tweak this and that. We can kind of tinker around the edges and keep this thing going on. Nobody here believes that's the right answer. Other folks said, well, yeah, we can fix this. We can keep going like we're going. We just need to raise taxes. Now, I'll tell you, not only does raising taxes not feel good in terms of if you're paying more taxes, we also believe that is still an unsustainable path. We have got to radically change the way the government is allowed to do business in this country, and we've got to give power back to the individual citizens and families of this country, and that's what the Heritage Plan does. That's what we're going to talk about this morning. I'm going to be joined in just a couple of minutes by 2 of the smartest men in Washington, my colleagues at Heritage, who are going to help us walk through this plan. But they're not just smart, they're principled. And Washington is full of lots of smart people. But you got to put the principles with the policies. You got to put the principles at the foundation, and that's what we do in this plan. Before they come out, however, just to give you a very quick summary of what we're going to talk about, I want to play a quick clip for you from Fox News earlier this year that gives you a nice summary of the plan, and then we're going to dig into the details. So with that, here is Jim Engel of Fox News with the summary of Saving the American Dream.
Across the political spectrum, there's agreement on a crushing reality. The U.S. is in big trouble.
Our debt has grown so large that we could do real damage to the economy if we don't begin a process now to get our fiscal house in order.
And the Heritage Foundation warns that without changes, current policies would require massive tax increases on every American.
If we just let the current programs operate in the future as they're designed under current law, tax rates in America would have to double for all taxpayers,
including businesses, which would threaten jobs. To avoid that, Heritage would limit future federal revenues to the modern average of 18.5% of the total economy.
That's essentially the upper bounds of what Americans have said they're willing to pay for their government. So the way we do that is to build in a strong cap on federal revenues, and we balance spending at that level.
On taxes, the Heritage Plan would eliminate hundreds of existing tax deductions, leaving only 3: the home mortgage deduction, charitable contributions and other gifts, and a deduction for higher education seen as an investment in the future. And a new flat tax would hit only income that is spent, not money saved.
If you have $50,000 in income and you save $25,000 of it, you save half of it, you only pay taxes on that other $25,000.
By all accounts, the biggest problems are Social Security and Medicare. As baby boomers retire, the nation faces tens of trillions of promised benefits the government cannot pay for. With that in mind, the Heritage Plan would actually increase benefits for the poor, but those better off would see a cut.
You get a smaller Social Security check, or you pay more of your premiums on Medicare.
Benefits start phasing out for a couple with $110,000 in income and end at $165,000.
they'd still get the Medicare program. They'd still be able to go to the doctor. It's just that they would pay full freight for their Medicare.
Heritage decided it's better to curtail benefits for the affluent than to continue giving them, then turn around and raise taxes to pay for them. Either way, this conservative plan takes great care to preserve benefits for those with modest incomes.
Well, that's a very short clip of everything that you can read in this full document. And if you go by the Heritage booth while you're here, we'd be happy to give you a copy of it that gives you all the details that are in the plan. But here to talk about it and just to kind of get started, first let me introduce my colleagues. Stuart Butler is the director of Heritage's Center for Policy Innovation. The Center for Policy Innovation is kind of what we call our iPod division at Heritage. It's our think tank within a think tank. But for 30 years, Stuart oversaw the domestic and economic policy at Heritage. He is the intellectual brains, if you will, behind a lot of policy ideas that many of you will be familiar with, including the welfare reform of 1996, and much of what is now today the school choice movement first began with Stuart Butler thinking about these things and talking with people for the past 20 to 30 years. So Stuart, we're delighted to have you here on the panel. Also joined by Dr. Matt Spalding. Matt is the Vice President of American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He is in charge, frankly, of connecting our founding principles to some of today's thorniest public policy issues. How do you apply our first and founding principles to all the issues that we're dealing with today? Many of you will remember Matt is the author of We Still Hold These Truths, which talked about here last year at the Values Voters Summit, and he's also the executive editor of Heritage's Guide to the Constitution. Matt, thank you for being here. Before we get into kind of the details of what this would mean for people sitting in this room and for folks around the country, Matt, when we talk about the American dream, what are we really saying is at stake here?
Well, I think it's important to start by not mincing words. There is a debate going on in this country over the American dream, and there's a connection between that argument and the connection back to this idea of American exceptionalism. These are intimately linked, right? The American idea and the dream that grows out of that is that of our founders. And it comes out of the Declaration of Independence. God has endowed us with unalienable rights. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness is what gives rise to the American dream, to that sense of unlimited opportunity and prosperity and the creativity to do things, to create these wonderful things in the world. It's that, and then the ability to enjoy the blessings of liberty that the Constitution speaks of, that is really the American dream. So, owning a home, having a good job, sending your kids to school. Those are the practical elements, but it's the ability to enjoy those things that's the key to the dream. But there's another dream, and it's very important to understand where that comes from. There's another dream. About 100 years ago, there was another argument, and the dream was that we can use government to engineer society. We can make it better, a greater society. And we can take those functions of government and create a welfare state, an administrative state that's very regulatory, right? And this gives rise to another dream that grows over the 20th century in liberalism, and now we're seeing it being argued very strenuously in the current administration, right? It's about redistributing wealth. It's about changing things. It's about making things more equal and more fair. It's diametrically opposed to the founders' vision. We see it in Van Jones' arguments about reclaiming the dream. It's a very liberal, progressive argument. The thing to understand now is that that debate has engaged. We're in an intellectual debate, a debate and a battle over the soul of what America means. But it has very practical things attached to it. It's not just the idea we're debating, it's the practical effects of this bad dream, which is essentially a nightmare that we've been suffering from for a long time, and now it's come to a head in this administration. It's caused massive problems. The welfare state, the administrative state, the debts, the spending, and that's what needs to be addressed, because if we don't address that, we will lose the American dream. And we won't have it for our children and for our children's children. And if you lose that, what you've lost is you've lost America. And we have to understand that this is a moral cause deep down, a deeply moral cause about saving this thing we call America.
And let's pick up on the moral issue of this, because I mean, Stuart, as you've been looking at things like Social Security, how do we deal with people we've made great promises to, but how are we then also honest to the next generation? How do you address that?
Well, you're exactly right, because really this is an issue about a very basic values question. What happens when, as a society, we've made a promise that is unsustainable, that can't be done? Imagine if the husbands in the room here had promised their wives, or maybe you have done, that you're going to have a nice big condo in Florida and you'll pay for it out of your 401k plan. And maybe your 401k plan has gone down in value in the last couple of years. This is not a very much a hypothetical for people, but let's assume that's happened. What do? Do you say, well, then we're still going to have that condo, and what we'll do is basically get our kids to pay for it all. We'll put them to work. Maybe some of you are in favor of doing that, but let's
Stuart,
say...
this is not going the right way here.
But as Richard Nixon said, you could do that, but it would be wrong. So would you feel that you should pass on that obligation to your kids, or should you sit down with your wife and actually renegotiate and say, well, what do we really need? What can we afford without impoverishing our kids and grandkids? And that's really what we've got to do on a massive scale today. As you said in the introduction, we have a situation where in order to fulfill the legal promise we've made, that's about $200,000 passed on to every child and grandchild in America. And so what we do is say, let's start afresh and say, let's think about how we can redesign this promise, that particularly in the entitlements area, Medicare, Social Security, these areas, and have a sensible, sustainable obligation in the future. And that's why we look at it in this way. We start thinking about, first of all, not digging ourselves a deeper hole. That means repealing Obamacare. It then means going on to say, well, when we look at Medicare and Social Security, what should be the principles behind them? And we feel that the principle should be what we call true insurance. To say our first priority should be to make sure that people who really need help to be economically and in terms of their health okay when they retire, let's make sure that that promise is fulfilled. But Warren Buffett does not need a Social Security check. He does not need subsidized prescriptions when he gets the flu. So rather than taxing him, why don't we say, let's start to reduce the amount of subsidy that we provide to upper income people. And that's the basic strategy that we have. There is no other alternative. It would be very nice to say, let's just promise everything to everybody. Let's somehow figure out that somebody will pay for it. Or we can be responsible. And that is why this is a fundamentally moral issue. We've been around the country talking about this really for the last 2 or 3 years. And in town hall meeting after town hall meeting, we show the facts. We say, here are the alternatives. You can double everybody's taxes. You can impoverish your kids and grandkids. Or you can say, let's start to look at how to change these basic promises and do it in a responsible way. And that's what our plan does. And we find when we go around the country, when people see that the alternatives are impossible, they gravitate and they see exactly the wisdom of this plan, and they think it's a moral approach to the situation that we're in.
And I'm going to put up a chart here that I think can both speak to this, and I should have warned you all, Stuart has a funny accent. But
We did have the language first, you know.
He gets me every time on that one.
We did make him a citizen, but he had to learn a few things first.
We did. I've just put a chart up on the screen, which you all can see here, that shows the trajectory, frankly, that we're on. And Matt, you can speak to this. I mean, this isn't the first time in our country that we've been in debt, but the question is, how do we deal with that, and where is government going in terms of now in the next 50 to 75 years?
There's another sense in which this is a moral question, because we have another promise that was made to the American people that is formed by the Constitution. That's the founding principles themselves are a promise to future generations. And that's how the founders understood it. And the problem is that not only has modern government made all these promises they can't sustain, which are a practical problem, but they've so misshapen how government operates by growing it and making it more administrative and regulatory and making those promises. In the meantime, expanding this welfare state such that it pushes out of the way civil society and all the institutions of civil society, that they've destroyed it in many ways. It is vastly out of proportion to the Constitution. And you see it in a chart like this, which just shows its growth over time. There's a trend here, as we say. And it's because of the project of modern progressivism and liberalism was to destroy the principles of the founding, right? To replace the idea of self-evident truths with relativism, to replace the idea of a limited constitution with a living constitution. Well, it's living too much is the problem. The problem is we're working under a understanding of government that is unlimited. It is by definition unlimited, right? That's why we have to pass laws before we see what's in them. We've turned so much over to regulators and bureaucrats to run things. They actually make what are the laws. We call them regulations. That promise has been broken as well. So we need to do two things. We need to get back to this notion that we're going to solve the practical problems we face as a nation, and we're going to keep the promises that have been made so that we can make sure that we as a society don't break down. But we're also going to fulfill another promise, but we've got to figure out how to get there, which is we are going to go back down the road to constitutional government, and we want to limit this behemoth and get it back to limits. And the way you're going to do it is start with the things that are obvious. Now, I happen to think there are a lot of massive things that are unconstitutional in this government, a lot of little things. But let's start with the big things, because you win the big things, you get the ball rolling. Obamacare is blatantly unconstitutional. It's a vast overreach. So let's go after those things. Break down the big things. Start breaking down the modern state, the welfare state, and then start going down this path. And the things we lay out here, cutting back massively cutting back in government spending, the Department of Education. You're moving in that path of getting this thing back under control again. But you've got to go down that path in a way that brings in the American people, that brings them in and doesn't alienate them. And you've got to do it in a way that shows that we are going to stand up for the kinds of obligations and promises set out in a fiscally responsible way that they have come to expect, and then bring them in and show them that we can actually govern ourselves and we can revive civil society to provide the kinds of help that in the founder's vision it was supposed to do.
I want to put up another chart that speaks, Matt, to something you just said, which is, we always ask the question, if you could be the budget cutter in Washington for a day, what would you cut? And I'm sure everybody in this room has a big list of things you would start with. I mean, Department of Education probably topping that for many folks in the room. But there's National Public Radio. There are a number of programs out there that we could look at. I'm sure the United Nations would have a few fans in the audience and be on their cutting list. But here's the problem.
The easier list is what not to cut.
Yeah, the easier list is what not to cut. Because the truth is when you look at cutting these programs, and I'm just going to put one up here that shows this, we can cut a lot of things, but they're not the big kahuna or the big elephant, shall we say, in the room. It's entitlements. It's what we got to face, and I don't think any chart more than this one kind of shows you what we're up against, because this is the one thing people say, cut this, cut that, cut waste, fraud, and abuse. But Stuart, even if we do all those things, we don't get to the magic number.
Well, I think the chart, completely underscores this, that it's absolutely correct to start looking at things that the government shouldn't do. And of course, we do that in our plan and we go through these. But there's no escaping the fact it's these large promises, the so-called entitlements, that really are the things that if we don't get under control, we will see either continuous massive debt and all the dangers associated with that, or huge tax increases if we're going to try to solve it in some other way. You know, it's interesting. Some of you have probably seen the ad that ARP has been running on television talking about the agreement and saying that, touching Medicare and Social Security, that wasn't part of the agreement. We should just get rid of waste and loopholes. Well, the waste and the loopholes are there on that chart, and they don't amount to a huge part of the problem. We have
a hill of beans is the technical phrase.
Is that right? Yes, yes. They really, we have to deal with these longer-term issues, and that's what organizations like ARP, I'm afraid, is just in denial about, or at least they're misleading people. There is no way to deal with this without tackling these issues and these programs. And that's what we seek to do. And as I said, we try to look at this in terms of doing two things: bringing these programs down to a level that secures the true promise we should be making, that if you work hard and play by the rules in America and things go badly for you, we are still going to help you as a society. We're going to make sure you're okay. But you're not just going to get an unlimited ability to have whatever you want, whatever the doctor and you desire, or a monthly check if you don't necessarily need it. And meanwhile, other people are hurt and future generations. We want to do that. And then the second thing we want to do is make sure, as Matt said, that the government does not grow. And that's why the other part of our plan says we will hold the line on taxes. We will not allow taxes in America to go beyond that level that Americans have said they are comfortable with for the last 20 to 30 years, which is about 18.5% of the economy. And so we hold the line on that, and we hit a balanced budget within 10 years, and we keep it there. That's the promise that we make, which is sustainable and actually can be done, and our plan shows exactly how to put that into place.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight on that. I mean, when you hear Washington and the politicians saying, well, we just can't deal with this now, or it's going to take government, this plan does balance the budget in 10 years, and it does keep it there. And there are people on Capitol Hill who've looked at this plan, and we want to talk about that at the end, who've said, you know what, we want to introduce pieces of this as legislation. This is real. We can make this happen. If we have enough of those folks on Capitol Hill, and if we have someone in the White House who's willing to put the pen to it, we can make a big difference a year from now. A year from now, hopefully we're having a very different conversation, a year and a couple months, I guess I should say, about what's really plausible. Stuart, let me ask you, on the tax plan, I mean, there's a lot of tax reform ideas out there. What's the most unique about this one?
Well, first of all, as I said, we keep within that total limit. But the important thing is we move to a flat tax in America. And a flat tax that has certain very particular elements. The main one being that if you save for the future, then whilst that money is being saved and invested, it is not taxed. We double tax savings in America. And that adds to our problem. So think of it as a giant IRA, unlimited, but not just for retirement, but for saving for a down payment for a house, for saving a car so that you can get a better job, for saving to put your kids through college. That savings would be exempt from taxation until it's spent. And if it's spent on education, for higher education, you would not pay any tax on that money. We really feel that investing in our children and investing in education is what the tax code should be encouraging. And it doesn't do that today. So it's a flat tax with this, as I say, a kind of a giant IRA for unlimited savings, which will boost the economy. It's the right thing to do because we want to encourage people to save for the future, not go into debt. And that's the essence of that tax system.
I think it's important to keep in mind that what all these things are driving towards is changing the paradigm. The current paradigm does not work. It is broken and unsustainable. And that paradigm is based upon constantly investing in government, right? That's what taxes essentially do. You're investing in government. We want to turn that and by these various aspects of policy change, bring about real reform, not piddling around the edges, not small things, but large, big reforms, because that's what's necessary, not only to break the back of the administrative state, the modern welfare state, which is destroying the country, when you think about it, and turn that and start going down the path where we can once again govern ourselves, right? And to do that, you've got to have the liberty to do that, but you also have the economic ability to do that. That's why you need to have better investment and more prosperity, because that allows you to buy your home and decide, make your decisions, and invest in your own future and be creative and enjoy the blessings of liberty. But you've got to do some very large transformative reforms to get there. And that's what we've got to do.
Well, you've already made mention, the very first thing we've got to do before anything in this plan or any other plan can happen is repeal Obamacare. That's
Absolutely.
number one, because nothing else works if we don't do that. But Stuart, you've been doing a lot of briefings out on the Hill with members and the like. What would be the next step? I mean, what are the first reforms that need to come into play?
Well, I think that in addition to adding to the problem, as you mentioned, then we've got to start modestly and quickly beginning to start changing the basic structure of these major entitlement programs. And that means you're not trying to hurt people. I mean, you're not trying to hurt them.
There are a lot of people sitting in this room thinking,
Yeah,
I've
absolutely.
paid into Social Security.
Look, it's taken a long time to cause this problem. It's going to take a long time to fix it, and you've got to fix it in a way that people can adjust to changes gradually. But the key is to start doing it. And that's why we've got to start looking at things like, for example, looking at the premiums people pay for Medicare Part B and Part D, that's the physician's benefits and the drug benefits, and start looking at much more intensively at how much people should be paying for those. That's a very real step to begin to start making savings. We've got to start moving towards a Medicare program that says, really, we provide you with enough to be able to obtain adequate health care when you retire, and not an unlimited benefit. Congressman Ryan has taken the first major step in that direction with his so-called premium support program. He is a very courageous man, as you've seen by the kind of reaction, the kind of vilification. Well, we all know that prophets are never listened to in their own age. But then we see later why they were right. Well, we've got to try to listen to some prophets right now, and hopefully some members of Congress will listen to them and start beginning to take these steps. So if you start to make adjustments slowly, you can get there. It's if you're in denial, then what's going to happen is we're going to get those changes, but America's going to look more like the way Greece is dealing with those changes. And we don't want that. It's not right. We don't have to do that. But we've got to get real and start to make these sorts of changes now. And that's what we find members of Congress understand. We're talking to them precisely how to do that. And I think reality is beginning to break out.
I think one thing to keep in mind here is that the argument to the left for some time now, which is getting clear and becoming more obvious as they're radicalizing in many ways, but they have argued that the modern state, the problems we have, that it's all inevitable. And this was the wave of the future, and this is modern government. This is it. And they're trying to convince you that there's no way out of the problem. And they're trying to convince you the only way out is so draconian that it's absolutely unacceptable, and they want to now scare the rest of the American people. But that's not the case, right? There's a parallel here, which is the miracle of compound interest, right? You invest a little now, and over time it grows. It's the same concept. But we need to make changes now that over time will play out to our benefit. And if you do that, this is solvable. This is not over by any means, but we have to act now to get it going.
I'm going to put up one final chart here that I think matches exactly to what you said, which is if we stay on our current trajectory, today we're what, 70% roughly, Stuart, in
and
debt?
rising.
And rising. 70%, that was of this morning at 10 a.m. But if you look here at the chart, we're headed up to 185. Well, 185%, how do you even do that? I mean, that's just that's worse than Greece, I would say, at this point, is it not? But then you can see the blue line is if we were to enact many of the reforms in the Heritage Plan, where we'd be headed, which is in the right direction, I would argue. Stuart, I mean, when you look at Greece and you look at other countries around the world and in Europe that are facing these kind of crises, what's different about what we can do versus what they're doing?
We've got time on our side, actually. We can take some steps now to really begin to divert from the trajectory that we're on. They, in Europe, have only woken up to the fact once they couldn't pay their bills, and once their lenders started basically saying their debt was impossible. We've already got the warning shots of this. Our debt has already been downgraded. So hopefully we will see that. And as Matt said, we have time if we're methodical about taking this action. That's the only choice. You either take action methodically, or you have action forced upon you. And the great thing about self-government and about we as Americans is that we have a history of taking action, of recognizing these things. And that's what we need to apply to this problem, like we've done to the others.
And it's always been a question about the character of the American people. And every so often, we come back to this and we make the right decision. I mean, this is truly a moral question. The objective of modern liberalism is to change and transform the nature of this country. They want to make it into a European-type state. The American people don't want that. And you have to understand that what the left is trying to do works against the deep undercurrents of this great nation, because it questions the very principles upon which it was founded. American exceptionalism, the ideas we believe in, the truths of the Declaration, we need to reclaim those, and to doing that, we need to save the American dream. It is a moral purpose we have here. There are a lot of numbers and policies we have to deal with. We have an adult conversation about those, but keep in mind what our object is, which is to save this country.
Matt, Stuart, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much. And as I mentioned earlier, and you saw our website up on the screen, savingthedream.org, I would encourage you over the course of the next year, there's not going to be legislation passed in an election year very likely that addresses these kind of tough issues. But as you all know, what we are in preparation for between now and the next 13 or 14 months is preparing for what happens come January of 2013. And that means getting policies teed up, ready to go into play when we have folks in Congress and someone in the White House that will save the American dream, that will help put us back on the right track. And I encourage you to help encourage them to do that very thing.